It started with silence. No scream, no shot, just a twitch. Private Dieter Holtz had been watching the tree line for 5 hours straight. Boots sunk into frost-crusted mud, steam rising from his breath. He reached for his canteen and never drank. A crack of motion, not even a sound. And then his helmet shifted backward like someone had nudged it. He blinked once, slumped forward, and folded like a rag doll. No one moved. The others stared, too afraid to even speak. When Feldwebel Kraus finally crawled over and rolled him, there was no blood, just a neat hole in his right eye. Exit wound somewhere behind the base of the skull. No muzzle flash, no echo, just death. Surgical, inevitable. Later, someone whispered, "It's them, the Red Snipers." That winter of 1942, the German 6th Army learned to fear quiet. It wasn't the bombs or the tanks that shredded their nerves. It was the space between, the absence, the waiting, and the certainty that a pair of eyes were already locked onto you, somewhere beyond rubble or birch trees, finger on a trigger. In Stalingrad, Soviet snipers weren't just soldiers. They were ghosts in padded jackets. Names scrawled on kill logs, whispers in German trenches, a pause in the breath before death. The Wehrmacht called them Der Schatten, the shadow. Some thought it was just propaganda, until men began dying mid-step, mid-sentence, mid-blink. No pattern, no logic, just gone. Reports began to circulate through command. Movement discouraged in daylight. Advance only after suppressive fire. Avoid open windows. Do not linger. It didn't matter. A major was shot through the ear hole of his helmet while climbing a staircase. 2 medics were killed while dragging a wounded man. One lieutenant emptied his pistol into a brick wall because he swore he saw something shift. They stopped using binoculars, stopped lighting cigarettes, stopped riding home. Because somewhere, out there, someone watched. That someone often wore a tattered ushanka and sat for 16 hours straight in frozen snowdrifts, unmoving. That someone pissed in a bottle, didn't blink for minutes at a time, and measured heartbeats to time their shot between pulses. That someone had a name like Zaitsev, Chekhov, Nikolina, Pavlichenko. But most never had names, just kill counts, a scratch in a logbook. One more minus before they vanished into white. Vasily Zaitsev was the name that rose above the fogs of fear. He didn't look like a killer. Soft-spoken, small-framed. Siberian eyes. He used an old Mosin Nagant with iron sights. No scope, nothing fancy. But in Stalingrad, Zaitsev was death incarnate. He killed 225 Germans in the city. So officially, unofficially, no one knows. He taught others, passed on the way of patience and nerves and invisible war. By the time German intelligence acknowledged the sniper threat, it was too late. Zaitsev became myth and man at once, a symbol of the Red Army's invisible fist. Every sniper he trained carried that legend forward, into every alley, every ruin, every trench. The Germans began to change, dug deeper, moved at night, carried mirrors on sticks, issued scoped Mausers, and trained counter-snipers. Some battalions burned buildings just to flush out snipers. They even allegedly sent a top marksman, Major Erwin König, to kill Zaitsev. What happened to König is still debated. Some say the duel never happened. Others say Zaitsev outweighted him, used a helmet to bait a shot, and put a bullet through König's scope. But no one in Stalingrad needed the story to be true. They needed to believe that death could be killed, that the ghosts could bleed. Because for weeks soldiers had scrawled strange things in their diaries. I heard breathing last night. But everyone was asleep. I dreamt I stood up. I woke up on the ground with a hole in my shoulder. Please, don't let me die like that. Not by them. One captured German NCO, after a week of interrogation, finally broke and said, "We don't fear dying. We fear never seeing it come." That was the legacy of the Soviet sniper in the first phase of the war. Not just the number of kills, but the silence they weaponized. The uncertainty, the cold fingers that reached into a man's chest and held his heart still before the bullet even landed, and it wasn't over. Because Stalingrad was just the beginning, and ghosts, once born, don't die easy. Stalingrad was more than a battle. It was a crucible, a place where men dissolved into ruin, and myths were born from smoke and bone. By the time the Germans realized how deeply embedded Soviet snipers were in the shattered cityscape, it was too late. The damage was already done, not just in bodies, but in minds. Every corridor was death, every window an eye. And in that claustrophobic hell, one figure rose above the others: Vasily Zaitsev. He didn't volunteer to become a legend. He had been a hunter. Grew up stalking wolves in Siberia with a grandfather who taught him patience as a virtue and silence as a weapon. When war came, he brought those skills with him. But Stalingrad refined them, sharpened them. He didn't hunt with rage, he hunted with calm. He would lie still for hours on broken concrete, wrapped in burlap and frost, eyes scanning through scope or bare iron sights. His rifle wasn't special, just a Mosin Nagant. But in his hands, it was a scalpel. Zaitsev recorded 225 confirmed kills during the Battle of Stalingrad, and trained dozens of snipers who collectively claimed thousands. But numbers weren't what defined him. What defined him was the method, the ethic. The idea that a well-placed shot could shift an entire front line, not just physically, but emotionally. He developed what became known as the 6 rules of a sniper. Change position often, camouflage everything, be patient, never fire twice from the same spot. Wait for your moment. Always finish the job. His most famous engagement, and one of the most controversial, was the alleged sniper duel with German Major Erwin König, a top shooter from the Wehrmacht's sniper school. According to Soviet accounts, König had been sent specifically to eliminate Zaitsev. The duel stretched over several days. No movement, no sound, just 2 men buried in rubble, each hunting the other through shattered glass and whispers. Zaitsev won, so the story goes. He used a decoy helmet to draw a shot and track the glint of Koenig's scope. One shot center mass. Silence afterward. The body was recovered, the scope kept as a trophy. But the West still debates if Koenig ever existed. Some claim he was a fabrication, a myth to elevate morale. Others argue that, real or not, the story reflects the truth. The Germans were desperate to stop the ghost who haunted their men, because Zaitsev wasn't alone. There were others. Dozens, hundreds. Snipers like Fyodor Oklopkov, who once eliminated 429 enemies. Nina Lobkovskaya, who led a sniper platoon of women who knew they were fighting not just for land, but for vengeance. And then there was Tatiana Baramzina, who fought until the Germans captured her. They crushed her fingers, gouged her eyes, and shot her. She didn't talk. These were not abstract heroes. They were patient, brutal, disciplined killers. Every one of them had to overcome the same hell: hunger, cold, fatigue, and the slow erosion of the soul that comes from staring at an enemy through a scope for hours, knowing the moment you see his eyes, you have to erase them. But they were effective, and the Germans knew it. In field reports, Wehrmacht officers referred to Soviet snipers as a plague. Morale surveys recorded rising anxiety over patrol duty. Soldiers refused to step into light. Some units had to rotate faster, not due to wounds, but breakdowns. Men would return pale, silent, staring at nothing. A diary from an Obergefreiter reads, "It's not the bullets. It's the not knowing. You move your foot, and maybe it's your last step. You scratch your nose, and maybe it's the last itch. I'd rather face a tank than these rats." By late 1942, the Germans began forming dedicated counter-sniper teams. They studied movement, built decoys, and issued scoped Karabiner 98K rifles. But it wasn't enough. Not against soldiers who could lie still in a chimney flue for 2 days or wait until snowfall to change position. Not against people who had learned to breathe with the rats and disappear with the shadows. In the ruins of factories and basements, a new kind of war had begun. One without front lines. One where a single pair of eyes could hold an entire company hostage. And Zaitsev's students, they took it further. They spread like frostbite, freezing whole sectors of the city with just the threat of being there. One German prisoner said, "The worst is not being shot. The worst is realizing you've already been seen, and there's nothing you can do about it." By the time Stalingrad ended and the Sixth Army shattered, Soviet snipers had left more than corpses in their wake. They left fear. They left doubt. They left a silence in the German war machine that no general could explain away. And the war was only halfway done. When the snows melted over Stalingrad's carcass, the Soviet sniper doctrine didn't vanish with the smoke. It evolved. Victory had proven something vital. A well-trained sniper was more than a trigger puller. They were multipliers. One hidden shooter could halt an entire battalion, could starve an offensive, could cripple morale in ways artillery never could. The Red Army took that lesson and built a machine out of it. The sniper school in the forests near Moscow, once a minor footnote, became an institution of ghost-making. Recruits were screened not just for aim, but for nerve. Could they wait 6 hours without moving? Could they shoot between heartbeats? Could they kill a man and feel nothing? Instructors drilled silence, stillness, calculation. Targets weren't just paper silhouettes, but scenarios. Windows, foxholes, helmets half visible through brush. They trained with camouflage, spent nights in freezing holes, learned to breathe through fabric to prevent fog on scopes. One of the most feared outcomes of that school was not a man, but a woman, Ludmila Pavlichenko. She killed 309 Germans, officially. That's not legend, that's Soviet documentation. A schoolgirl turned history student turned hunter, she once stalked 2 enemy snipers over 3 days and killed both. During a press tour to the U.S., she famously told American journalists, "I'm 25 years old, and I've killed 309 fascists. Don't you think you've been hiding behind my back for too long?" She wasn't propaganda. She was death in a skirt, and she wasn't alone. The USSR deployed thousands of women as snipers, not because of equality, but because women were steadier under pressure, better at concealment, and often more disciplined. The enemy called them white witches. Men who survived engagements with them often refused to speak of it. But sniping wasn't glory. It was decay. A sniper didn't charge. They waited, sometimes for days, in dirt, in blood, in silence. They watched men eat, talk, smoke, and then removed them from the world with a twitch. Some began to keep diaries. not for legacy, but for sanity. One reads, "I shot a man eating bread today. He shared it with another. I waited until the second bite. It felt wrong. I did it anyway." Another, "The eyes stay with me even after the rest of the body's gone, especially the eyes. There are no medals for what that does to a mind." Some broke. One sniper, after 70 confirmed kills, began talking to his rifle. Wouldn't sleep unless it lay beside him. Another walked into enemy fire deliberately. They found no wounds, just an empty expression, and spent rounds in his pocket. The Germans tried everything. They issued scope modifications, trained counter-sniper teams, dug sniper pits in anticipation. They used artillery to level suspected nests, sent patrols with body armor and shields. Still, men kept dying in silence. In a field near Kursk, a Wehrmacht officer watched his unit lose 3 men in 5 minutes. "No sign, no flash, no sound," he wrote. "We are not fighting men. We are hunted by shadows, and shadows don't bleed." In response, the Germans deployed sniper traps, using wounded as bait, tying corpses to strings to simulate movement, even sending dogs with flares. Sometimes it worked. More often, it didn't, because the Soviet sniper wasn't hunting for sport. They were executing war with surgical purpose, and behind every shot was a reason. Some fought for revenge, entire families gone in a single bomb. Some fought for survival, some because they no longer knew how not to. But all of them carried one truth: a bullet costs less than a tank. By 1944, sniper units became essential attachments to Soviet infantry, 1 per squad, sometimes 2. In dense forest, in villages, in fields, always watching, always waiting. Their motto wasn't shouted, it was whispered: "See first, kill first, leave no echo." And the war wasn't over. Ahead waited East Prussia and Berlin, and the final act of a campaign where silence, once a fear, had become a doctrine. The roads into East Prussia were lined with ash and broken stone. As the Red Army advanced westward, the sniper war didn't diminish. It intensified. Now it wasn't just trenches and fields. It was ruins, stairwells, forests soaked in fog and memory. The land itself seemed to whisper warnings, and the snipers moved with it. Silent, precise, merciless. They weren't just hunters anymore. They were instruments. Edges honed by 3 years of war. In Königsberg, Soviet sharpshooters climbed into bell towers and gutted German officers before breakfast. In the forests near Allenstein, squads disappeared into the trees and left only corpses behind. One German report from 1945 describes a scene where 4 men entered a barn. One came out. No footsteps, no shots, just 3 dead. They were everywhere, it reads, but mostly they were nowhere. Berlin was the last crucible. As the city cracked under bombardment, as civilians flooded cellars and streets turned into killing fields, the snipers followed. Sometimes they were used for counter-sniper work, sometimes to pin down machine gunners, sometimes simply to sow terror. One sniper, records say, picked off 32 men in a single day from a 3rd-story window above a collapsed bakery. He changed position 3 times. Never left a trace. Another, known only as Mikhail G., was found dead beside 28 empty shell casings. All spent, all fired, everyone a kill, according to the forensics. But the story didn't end with the fall of the Reich, because the legacy of the Soviet sniper, the methods, the psychology, the doctrine, it didn't die in 1945. It was reborn, in jungles, in deserts, in cities, in every modern battlefield where precision, fear, and silence are weapons more devastating than steel. Post-war militaries studied Soviet tactics religiously. From Vietnam to Chechnya to Iraq, echoes of those first ghosts moved through the rubble. They taught that the battlefield is not just about who shoots first, it's about who watches longer, who waits better, who becomes the ground. Some of those snipers never went home. Others did, broken, quiet, disassociated. Few gave interviews. Fewer still ever picked up a rifle again. Not for sport, not for pride. One veteran, years later, visited a museum and found his name on a list of kills. He stood for a moment, then he said, "I don't remember the faces, but I remember the moments. The pause before, the breath after." You never forget that. Not really. Today, their names are etched in stone, in Russian memorials, in forgotten war diaries, in bullet-ridden walls that still stand in Eastern Europe. But their true legacy lives in the minds of those who feared them. A former German soldier, interviewed in the 1980s, stood near the remains of a bunker outside Silo Heights. The grass had grown back, the trenches were gone. But he didn't look at the landscape. He said only this: "I feared tanks. I feared bombs. But I feared them the most. Because you never heard the bullet that killed your friend. You only heard him fall." In the end, the Soviet snipers weren't the biggest killers of the war, but they were its sharpest silence. And that silence still echoes. If you want more stories like this, the ones that don't blink, don't flinch, and don't turn away, you know what to do. Stick around. The ghosts haven't finished speaking.